So, it is the penultimate match day of the Bundesliga season, or it has happened. Now, obviously, there's heading into the final day, there's still a lot to play for, and it will be very interesting. So, let's look back at why that is the case. So the final Friday game of the season was actually a pretty decent one between Borussia Dortmund and Eintracht Frankfurt. This is actually the first game of the year, as in 2026. And it was surprisingly a good performance from Dortmund, especially considering how rubbish they've been since they qualified for the Champions League. But despite going down a goal early, they managed to score 3 times unanswered. And managed to hold off at the end a late Frankfurt revival. Because obviously take you back to the first game of 2026, Dortmund had to score late on to rescue a point. So they managed to hold Frankfurt off from potentially doing what they did to them. And Samuel Inacio scored his first goal for the club, and obviously he has been a big beneficiary of Dortmund being able to wrap up Champions League football soon, early enough, because now he gets game time and stuff, and with the likes of Julian Brandt leaving, then there should be a bigger role for him to play next year. Obviously, what was also announced at the beginning or at the end of last week was that Niklas Süle would retire actually at the end of the season. Instead of, it had already been announced he was leaving, but he's decided to retire. And I think, as many people have mentioned with Süle, it's really a case of Süle at Dortmund. It's really a case of what could have been. Like, injuries have basically killed his 4 years here, or 4 years at the club. And if he was fit, when he was fit, he wasn't at his best. Like he should have been the replacement or like the heir for Mats Hummels, but that wasn't the case because he was never really fit. Well, for Frankfurt, they are in real danger now of missing out on Europe because they folded recently so much. And there's been talk that, Riera will actually, Frankfurt will get rid of him in the summer. And I talked about that last week. And what was interesting in this game is it seems from the camera, or the way that the cameras were done, that after Jonathan Burkhardt scored the second goal for Frankfurt, he was shushing someone. And the camera pans to Albert Riera on the sideline, whether it was potentially him. So who knows whether Burkhardt was shushing Riera. If he did, it's cinema. It's real cinema hours at Frankfurt. Yeah, Frankfurt are in real trouble because they play Stuttgart next week. And Stuttgart themselves have a good chance of making European football next season. To be more specific, Stuttgart could have taken a big step towards Champions League football. They beat Leverkusen 3-1. So Leverkusen actually took the lead through a very early goal from Alex Garcia, but Stuttgart were able to rally, score literally minutes after through Ermedin Demirovic, and then goals from Maximilian Mittelstadt and Dennis Undav kind of like secured the win for Stuttgart in a way. It was a very good performance, and now they are in pole position to get the final Champions League spot, ahead of Leverkusen and Hoffenheim. In fact, Leverkusen, the fact they lost this is not ideal, mainly for their goal difference, as they now need to hope Stuttgart lose to Frankfurt, and then Leverkusen have to beat Hamburg by more than 2 goals to then overtake Stuttgart. And then they also have to hope Hoffenheim lose as well, because they're 3 points behind of both of them. But for Stuttgart, I really think, they're kind of laying the foundations for a big season next year. A bit similar to Leverkusen, dare I say, from a couple of years ago. With how they're ending this season, they're ending it quite strongly. Obviously, everything's coming together and the players are doing well. I think it'd be interesting to see what they do in the summer. And especially if Bayern struggle with the World Cup, as in all of the players are going to the World Cup, whereas Stuttgart, not as many will be going. And there'll be a lot of fatigue for Bayern eventually in the season. If I was a betting man, I would be betting some money on Stuttgart to do well. I'm of the strong idea that Stuttgart could easily finish second this season, or next season, I mean. And potentially they're the one to take advantage if Bayern slip up. Well, for Leverkusen, Kasper Heumann, I think they will probably part ways with him in the summer. I think he's been a decent transitional manager for them, especially after the shit show that was Ten Hag. But now they need to some way find a manager to take them to the level that they deserve to be at, and which they were previously at. Then obviously the other team that, as I mentioned, Hoffenheim, they beat Werder Bremen 1-0. So they obviously keep pace with the teams above them. Werder Bremen, despite losing this, ended up being safe because of other teams. But again, I think Hoffenheim on the final day, Hoffenheim play Borussia Mönchengladbach on the final day, which, considering how Gladbach have been playing, it should be an easy win for them. Speaking of Gladbach, they lost 3-1 to Augsburg. Augsburg now could potentially qualify for the Conference League. They currently only find themselves 1 point behind Freiburg in 7th. And considering, as I mentioned, Frankfurt are playing Stuttgart and Frankfurt in quite poor form, while Freiburg's priorities obviously lie elsewhere, and they also play Leipzig on the final day, while Augsburg play Union, who have absolutely nothing to play for. There's a real possibility that Augsburg could play in the Conference League next season, which is the biggest games gone I've seen in my life. Speaking of Leipzig, they are back in the Champions League. They beat St. Pauli 2-1, so the win secured their return to the Champions League. Obviously they missed out last year, but I think, considering everything for Leipzig this season, the massive turnover they had in the summer, and the inexperience of the people they've brought in at this level, whether that be the head coach Ole Werner or the likes of Jan Diomande, I think this has been a very good season from Leipzig. Well, for St. Pauli, this was probably the worst possible result, because then they were waiting to see how the teams that they were competing with, so Wolfsburg and Heidenheim, did, to then determine what will happen to them on the final day. And so after this game, Wolfsburg played Bayern, and they ended up losing 1-0. And that was a great Michael Elise goal. But this was really a case where Wolfsburg did not take their chances at all. They had an XG of 3 and could not score, which is a testament to the work Jonas Erbig did in goal, as well as just the wastefulness of Wolfsburg. And they could potentially live to regret these chances, because now this sets up an interesting final day, because on the final day, Wolfsburg plays St. Pauli, and because of another result, which we'll get to, if they draw and this other team wins, they're both going down. Whereas Wolfsburg's fate is in their own hands. You know, they just need to win, or better Heidenheim's result against St. Pauli. And they should have the quality to do that. And granted, the best Wolfsburg can do is actually just finish in the relegation playoff. So they're not exactly safe completely. But obviously, considering how the Bundesliga team has fared in the relegation playoff, obviously they probably heavily back themselves. This obviously sets up in the final day quite nicely. Hamburg beat Freiburg 3-2. Obviously, this is a good performance from Hamburg. They had confirmed their safety last weekend. Well, Freiburg, obviously, the chance to qualify for Europe, or solidify their place in qualifying for Europe, but they were unable to take it. But again, you know, Freiburg are dealing with a bit of a performance hangover, if we're being honest, from last Thursday when they beat Braga to make it to the Europa League final. So that was kind of given, and obviously that's probably Freiburg's priority at the moment, the fact that they could end with the trophy. And then the last important game, because as I'm recording this, Mainz is playing Union. But at the end of the day, that game's fucking meaningless, because both of these teams have nothing to play for. So I think there's nothing to say. And so the last meaningful game is between Cologne and Heidenheim. So Heidenheim needed to win, especially after Wolfsburg and St. Pauli have lost. And if they won, it would improve their chances of staying up. Again, they would still need to win their final game of the season against Mainz, but and hope the other two draw. But it's the best they could do. and they ended up beating Cologne 3-1. Like, they scored early on, Cologne equalised, but then they managed to rally and score twice more. And so Heidenheim are literally one of the most informed teams in the Bundesliga now because of what they've been able to do. And they managed to hold off Cologne, who absolutely dominated them in the second half, but they managed to hold them off. And now, like a month ago, Heidenheim should have been relegated. But since then, they've just kind of locked in and only lost one of the last 7 games. and so now, because of how crap both Wolfsburg and St. Pauli have been, there's a real chance that they could stay up. And as I said, they're more informed than Wolfsburg and St. Pauli. And they have an easier fixture because they're not playing either one of them in Mainz. And obviously with the goal difference as well, Heidenheim have also leapfrogged St. Pauli, so they're not even dead last anymore. So even if next week Heidenheim go down, they've put in a very valiant effort to basically turn themselves from near relegation to finishing 17th, for example. Obviously last season Heidenheim were kind of in a similar position. They needed to beat, I think it was Werder Bremen, and Hoffenheim got smacked by Bayern. Hoffenheim did get smacked by Bayern, but Heidenheim lost to Bremen. So they actually kind of have experience in this sort of situation, and so they potentially learn from it too. And if they do, and if they take this experience that they've learned, and they apply it to here and do the best they can, then obviously anything is possible. Obviously, even if Heidenheim make the relegation playoff, I do think they'll go down because they only got by the skin of their teeth last season. And what makes this all the more interesting is they could potentially play Elversberg next season too, because Elversberg have not secured promotion yet, and it's a 3-horse race for 1 promotion spot in the Zweite Bundesliga. So heading into next weekend, obviously, that basically everywhere is meaningless apart from 3 key areas: the Champions League spot, the Conference League, and relegation. So, Champions League, Stuttgart 4th on 61, Hoffenheim 5th on 61-2, and Leverkusen is 6th on 58. For the Conference League spot, Freiburg is 7th on 44, Frankfurt is 8th on 43, and Augsburg is 9th on 43. Augsburg have a worse goal difference than Frankfurt and are 3 goals off of Freiburg. And then at the bottom of the table, Wolfsburg is 16th on 26, Heidenheim are 17th on 26, and St. Pauli are 18th on 26. Heidenheim and St. Pauli are both 3 goals worse off than Wolfsburg. And on the final game of the season, the final games of the season to watch out for Europe, Frankfurt play Stuttgart, Leverkusen play Hamburg, and Hoffenheim play Gladbach. Conference League, Frankfurt, Stuttgart, Augsburg, Union, and Freiburg, Leipzig. And then for relegation, it's St. Pauli, Wolfsburg, and then Heidenheim at home against Mainz. It will be very interesting, and there's a lot more to play for on the final day than I think a lot of people thought would have been a couple of weeks ago. And I think it's going to be very exciting, especially the fight to avoid relegation. So let me know what you think about this weekend, if you're excited for the final day of the season, because I am. And yeah, any other thoughts you may have.